Okay, thank you very much, Diane, for being here today and for going through this interview. We have, well, quite a number of questions for you today. And let's start with the first one, which is, when did you start working on sign language and why?
Well, I started to work on sign languages actually when I was an undergraduate in college at the California State University, Northridge. I had encountered sign language a few years earlier and started taking sign language courses when I was in high school. And then I encountered linguistics and started taking linguistics courses. And I thought that I just had these two very different interests for a long time until I started to learn about sign language linguistics at CSUN from other people who were doing work in the area. And I was fortunate, very fortunate, in that one summer while I was still an undergrad, there was a group of people from the Salk Institute who came up to CSUN to give a presentation about the work, the research they were doing. I think they were hoping to recruit mostly deaf researchers, but they recruited me in the end, and I went on to graduate school there simply because of that experience. So it was a great start to learn about the kind of research that people were doing.
And do you mind being labeled as a sign language linguist?
I don't mind being labeled as a sign language linguist. That's what I do, but as long as linguists who are not sign language linguists don't think that that means there's a sharp dividing line and whatever I do is not relevant to what they do. And sometimes it certainly does happen that people think that what the sign linguists do is, oh, that's interesting and different, and they keep their distance from it. And I prefer for that not to happen, but I primarily work on sign languages. It's not exclusive. I work on other unspoken languages as well, but I'm happy to be a sign linguist.
What are the major changes that you have experienced in sign language research over the past decades?
Well, I would say that there has definitely been an expansion in terms of the kind of research that's being done, and that there's been a move from what was still primarily an attempt to prove that sign languages are languages during the time when I was being trained. A gradual shift now to being much more interested in both similarities and differences between sign languages and spoken languages. It used to be important not to talk about the differences, and I think that's not true anymore, so that's been a big shift. And I think there has been growth, and there have been people in different areas of linguistics more and more, although still there are areas where I think a lot more effort should be made, and also I would like to see more growth in the number of deaf scholars who are working on their languages.
And looking back, did you also observe changes in deaf communities in the US and other countries where you have worked over these past decades?
I think the biggest effect has come and will come from the spread of the use of cochlear implants, because it means that a lot of deaf people are growing up now with even more limited exposure to sign languages and deaf communities. And that means that the deaf community may well be shrinking in a lot of places. So that's been a big concern in terms of what's happening in the deaf community, what's happening with the future of the sign languages. The fact that a lot of people are not going to deaf schools, that had already been an issue, but now even fewer are using sign language, it seems. So I think that's a big issue. On the other side, there has been an increase, I think, in the number of deaf scholars, but that's been slow, and I think it would be nice to see that grow.
And well, you work basically in the United States, but you also have a lot of collaborations with Europe and also with South America. What are the main differences between the US and Europe with respect to sign language research, if any?
I think I'm not sure I can pinpoint differences between the way sign language research is done. There are, sort of in a broad sense, there are lots of small differences. There's no ASL corpus, for example, so that affects some of the things that people do. One of the things I think that affects the way research is done in the US is that there are so many different, it's not enough, but still many different labs doing different kinds of research across the country without a lot of data sharing, without a lot of commonality in annotations or things like this. And so it means that it's in some ways slower in the US for some kinds of growth because it's not concentrated, it's not coherent. And because in Europe, with small countries, there may be only one lab or one primary group or maybe two, but then there isn't the need to worry about things like standardizing across groups, which I think is an issue in the US. You mentioned Brazil. There have been so many changes in Brazil in the last few decades or a little more than that, with the expansion of training of deaf students, that that's affected a lot in terms of what's happening there. There's a lot more going on in that area than in the US, which is an interesting contrast.
And, well, just asking the big question, what do you think is the potential contribution of sign language research to linguistics and related disciplines?
Well, I think the same issues that have been brought up by many people are still quite important, which is to know that language is not limited to the spoken modality and what are the properties that transcend modality. The issue of modality differences has long been discussed, but I don't think it's stale. I think it's still an important thing to consider. And it's very important for the notion of the way language works or the way that language evolves or the way that language is acquired to include data from sign languages as well as from spoken languages. So I think that there's a lot to contribute from that point of view. It's also important to help with drawing the lines between the fact that language is not restricted to the spoken modality, expanded to include sign languages, but not to be too loose, because I have seen I've seen some people, maybe not scholars, make the leap to say, doesn't matter, language can be spoken or signed, or it can be anything, and that goes too far, because it's not anything, it's restricted, and we need to know where the lines are, right? So I don't mean to be saying that there isn't anything other than speech and sign, but that we need to know where the limits are and what constitutes a system of the type that we would normally call human language. So those systems are important to be understood well.
Mm-hmm. You are the chair of the Sign Language Linguistics Society, SLLS, which is an international academic association of sign language linguists. What are its goals in general?
The very general goals are to promote the research on sign languages, to promote sign language linguistics and encourage its continuation, encourage its development. We actually just had a meeting not long ago where we were discussing the ways that we would implement this goal and what kind of, how we might broaden the goal, or how we might consider the goal in its broader sense in the way that we work. So there may be some future developments in that way, but I'll hold on to the next question.
Yeah, so what have been and what are the main lines of activity currently?
Yeah, so I think the main activity has always been the promotion and maintenance of the the conference, the Theoretical Issues in Sign Language Research Conference, which is now held every 3 years. The society, in part, was established to ensure that this activity would continue. And that it's still sort of one of the thing we spend the most time on is working on making sure that this conference continues. We also have a website, and we try to post new information there. We have social media accounts to convey new information to people, and email lists. But we are considering possible ways to expand what we do and make belonging to the society a greater value for sign language researchers. Mm-hmm. We have also been involved in making statements of support for various activities of sign linguists, and we have entered into an agreement with the World Federation of the Deaf to work on our mutual interests, which is one of the other things that we are starting to expand on it at this time.
Yeah, so this partially answers what I wanted to ask next. Do you think that an academic society like SLLS can make a difference for the situation of sign languages, deaf communities, and deaf signers in general?
I think that we can we can lend an official support to various actions, such as recognition of sign language in places where that's been pursued. And in that sense, I think that we can be supportive. I think there are a lot of limits to what we can do practically in helping various things like this. We're not the kind. Well, I mentioned the World Federation of the Deaf. They're very active and they have a large staff. They have a lot of involvement in different activities, and we don't work that way. It would be a major change for us to become that kind of a group. But I think that we are interested in having a component that is supportive of the political or educational or life needs of the deaf communities. And also, we are interested in supporting people who want to get into doing research and expanding where research is being done. Helping out in things like that. So I think we will move in some of those directions.
Great. So now coming to your work. So within sign linguistics, what are your main areas of research currently?
Currently I'm mostly focusing on work on acquisition of sign languages, including sign language acquisition by deaf children with deaf parents. This is a project I have been doing to different extents for a long time, but what I'm focusing on now is a project that's very practical to make a data set that I collected in the past fully annotated and available for other researchers to use. So I'm interested in corpus building for the sake of sharing with researchers for the sake of enhancing research. That's not a research question but a tool, but I'm invested in that on one hand. I'm also very much interested in continuing to analyze data that comes from this data set and other data on the way that deaf children acquire sign languages. But in part now, there's another sort of practical angle to that because I'm developing a project that I hope will be funded and will take off to look at the way that deaf children develop sign language when they're not in deaf families but in hearing families who have decided to include a sign language as one of their languages. And we also very much want to see how the parents are learners of a sign language in that context. People haven't really thought about the parents as learners and how they learn sign language and how that happens, as well as how that relates to their children's development. So that's a project that we have been working on. That's a project I'm doing with Deborah Chen Pickler and Elaine Gale and John Henner are all part of the proposal. We hope that we will have some money and we'll start doing that project soon. That relates in a way also to another project that I've been spending a lot of time on in the past years, which is to look at how children acquire both a sign language and a spoken language. So the bimodal bilingualism project, which was primarily looking at hearing children and deaf families, so coda children, to see their bilingual development, but also we looked at deaf children who are native signers parents or signers, and the children have received cochlear implants. So that we can see in this context where children are exposed to a sign language from birth, what does their bilingual development look like? And since we found that they were so similar to the hearing children and the coda children in their development of both the sign language and the spoken language, that has been part of the motivation for saying, well, let's see what happens now if the goal is this bimodal bilingualism, but the family are still learners of a sign language. So that new project that will be coming. But another thing that developed out of the project on that development of bimodal bilingualism was an interest in the way that co-blending works. So we looked at the children and the people interacting with children and the way that they use their two languages simultaneously. We became very interested in understanding more about how that can be derived, what kind of structures are required for that. And we discovered that in order to really investigate that further, we would need data from people who use more complex language than 2-year-olds. So we are now in the middle of a project with adult codas to look at the kinds of structures that they will use in code blending, and just how complex it can get. We will be collecting data next month, and so I'm very hopeful that this will lead to a lot of new analyses. And this is also a project with a number of other people, including Jones Quadros, and doing the parallel project in Brazil. Also, Suzanne Verbrand and Jonathan Bobliak are working with us on the theoretical analyses, and I think that will be a nice step up from where we've been. So looking very much forward to having some more complex co-blending data and being able to say more about how it can be derived.
Well, amazing, the range of topics you are covering.
Yeah, I don't seem to be able to focus, do I?
No, because actually you determine what the partly of what the agenda is of the field, but if you take one step back and talk about the field in general, what should be, according to you, the priority research topics or areas for the field as such?
Yeah, I think that depends a lot on the way we're looking at the field, right? So because in sign linguistics, there's this very strong need for a practical, applied area of research because it affects the lives of deaf people so strongly to have the language recognized and to have the language used with deaf children. So there's on one side, knowing about the way that exposure to a sign language early on affects deaf children's language development and their cognitive development. This is very important for those reasons, right? So that's why I think this is one area that requires a lot of attention. When we think of the field as being more like linguistics and cognitive science that you asked about earlier, those kinds of questions are still important, but there would be much more also of an interest in having more in-depth studies of the grammars of different sign languages. I'm very happy that there has been such a project, there is still such a project in Europe to have a greater description of the structures that are parts of the different sign languages involved in that. I'd like to see a lot more of that happening so that we can address those questions about the modality effects and about the range of the properties that languages have, these kinds of things. I think that's very important also. So it would be important to have not only the range of languages that have been studied, but a wider range of sign languages studied. We still have, I think we still know too little about sign languages from, especially from countries other than Europe and the US, and it would be really good to get more information about the way that sign languages work in different areas.
Absolutely. So would you say that sign languages are endangered languages?
Well, probably many of them are. Probably maybe all of them are, in the sense that with the development of cochlear implants and the decrease in the number of children who are exposed to a sign language at an early age, it's possible, and I think it may even be a goal of some people that sign language would no longer be needed from the point of view of those who think that it's a tool only. On the other hand, in the US at least, the National Science Foundation does not consider sign languages to be, or at least not in general, to be endangered. They don't consider ASL, American Sign Language, to be endangered. And this is based on a perspective of a way that they define endangered languages for the funding that they give out. And I guess that's because they've concluded that there are enough speakers currently and that there is enough robustness in the transmission that it will not die out anytime soon. So I don't know whether they're right about that conclusion. It's definitely fair to be worried about sign languages being endangered, and especially in some areas where either the use of cochlear implants is just becoming overwhelming, and or where the numbers of signers or signing communities are quite small anyway in the first place. I'm sure there are some sign languages that would meet the NSF requirement for being endangered because of being a small community in the first place. But I think we can be concerned about sign languages being endangered in the broader sense.
So you've mentioned some of the main issues about endangerment, but what are the most urgent issues to be addressed with particular policies for sign languages, and who should sign language advocacy be addressing in this respect?
Well, I think that it has to do with different types of issues and also different places where, depending on who has the power for things. So, for example, as we've already mentioned, Brazil. In Brazil, the official national recognition of Libras as one of the country's languages had a lot of cascading effects for education of deaf people, education in sign language, etc. So for some places, targeting something like national recognition would be a good way to go about making such changes, because that would have a cascade of implications that would hit a number of different areas that would need to be focused on. In the US, this is not something that's very plausible. We have no official languages in the US, and if we did have an official language in the US, it would be English, which a number of people who are pushing an English only or an English first kind of agenda would like to see, to the exclusion of other languages at all, right? So the only consequence of the country adopting language policies that I can envision are bad ones, where the language policy leads to the exclusion of other languages. So fighting for recognition of ASL as a language in the US, I don't think is going to be very successful. So for a place like the US, the approach should be somewhat different, should be more focusing on potentially individual states where the effects might be different, but more focused on education affecting certain kinds of things, or health policies affecting other things, something like this. It has to be broken down into more narrow areas in order to have the kinds of effects that that you might want to see in the different domains. Of course, in the research domain, we could say that we want to have advocacy for support of sign language research, and that is also something that is important and but depends on the place. You know, in Europe versus in the US versus other places, the way to approach this is probably very different depending on the way that these decisions are made. So in the US, as it turns out, the NSF Linguistics Division is a good supporter of sign language research. They do support a fair amount of it, although the amount of money that can be used by any single project is much more limited than it is in other agencies. The National Institutes of Health, in the area of deafness, they do support sign language research, but they are primarily a health agency, so they primarily have a viewpoint, a medical viewpoint, and a viewpoint that says, you know, it has to be related to health issues, right? So it's not possible to make a broad statement about we need to target this particular group, because it's going to depend on what area of effect you're looking for. Education policies versus research policies versus other kinds of things. So probably the best general answer to the question is that the people we should be addressing these arguments to are the ones who have power. But that's sort of usually the case when we talk about advocacy. The people who have power need to be the ones who are convinced to see the world a little bit differently. Sometimes the powerless people need some convincing as well, if they're unaware of the issues or the reasons for making the arguments.
Yeah. So just to close, what would you suggest doing to someone who does not know anything about sign languages?
Well, do you mean if the person wants to know more about sign languages, and first of all, and then secondly, sort of for what reason they're interested in knowing about this. So if it's a person who is a linguist and they don't know anything about sign languages, but they're open-minded, they want to learn more about the way that sign languages work, then certainly we can direct them to some overview papers or studies about sign languages. There is a recent MOOC by Sam Sukala. I haven't looked at it yet, but it's probably helpful in this regard, and there are other ones as well. I think you were involved in one. Were you? No? Anyway, okay. So there are various ways of teaching people about sign language research and sign language linguistics that way. But if they're interested in continuing to learn more about it and perhaps to get involved into sign language research, clearly what they need to do is learn sign language, and in order to do that they need to interact with deaf people. So that's got to be part of the answer, and that's of course also the answer to people who are educators or senators or anything else. If they don't know something about sign language, they want to know more about sign languages, then ways of having them interact with deaf people is the best way to have them understand more about the situation. I think that's an answer in general. When people are not understanding and not knowing about people who are different from them in whatever way, usually if they just start to get to know some, then they'll understand a lot more about it, and they'll have a much better, much more open mind and much more understanding about the situation. So that's another reason to encourage deaf people becoming scholars and becoming advocates and having the training for being able to do those kinds of things themselves. Great. So thank you very much, Diane, for all your answers. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Our pleasure. Okay.